Sure do like my new table. I'm not sure who put this together. I suspect Candy and Scott had something to do with it. So, start out with a story. We went to Dan and Monica and Carter and Stephen and Savannah and Erica. I almost forgot Erica. I can't forget her, but she was in her room for part of the time because she wasn't feeling well. And we got to hear a few stories. We had a great time over at their house. So one of the stories they said is Dan was saying that about 6 or 7, Savannah was walking around with him, walking out in the yard. And Savannah looked up at him and said, "Dad, am I adopted?" And he said, "No, where did you get that idea?" And she said, "Well, I'm just fancier than the rest of you." So I thought, and you know what? She is really fancy, I'm going to tell you. I was very impressed by Savannah. So I don't want us to be too fancy to feel like we don't have something still to learn. Because we should be learning our entire lives. And part of what we're doing in this series called Come to the Tables, we're trying to revision and rethink the significance and the meaning of the Lord's Supper. So last week we talked about how you go from the altar to the table. You have the sacrifice of Jesus, which then forms this community that meets around the table. And in the first century, it was a table much like this one, close to the floor, and people would sit around it. And when they partook of the Lord's Supper, it was a full-fledged meal. They probably ate meat, and they had a lot to drink. And then at some point during that meal, they recognized the death of Jesus Christ. It was a covenant meal, by the way. So one of the things that we're going to be talking about today, the title is From Covenant to Table, is the significance of covenant. Not only was it a covenant meal, but it was actually a covenant renewal meal, because the covenant already happened. It happened at the death of Jesus, and when we accepted that through our baptism, and it was sealed with the Holy Spirit that came into our lives. So when we partake of the Lord's Supper, it's a covenant renewal meal. What we have to understand is most of these early Lord's Supper meals were primarily Jews, and this practice arose out of a deep Hebrew history and a deep Hebrew theological understanding of God. So today, I want us to dig back into the Old Testament with the purpose of learning more about this Hebrew practice, this Hebrew concept of God, so that it can then bring greater significance and meaning to us when we partake of the Lord's Supper. So I want to first talk to you a little bit about some sacrifices, because all of these covenant meals or covenant renewal meals had a sacrificial component to it. So there were 3 types of sacrifices in the Old Testament. There was the burnt offering, and the burnt offering was burned to a crisp. No one could eat it, period. It was given to God. The sin offering is one that was sacrificed for your sins, and that offering was only eaten by the priest. They would take it back after the offering, and the priest would eat that meal. Most of these sacrifices were meant to be eaten. Only the guilt offering, the burnt offering rather, was not eaten. Then you have the fellowship offering, and the fellowship offering was always eaten. Most of the offerings and sacrifices in the Old Testament were fellowship offerings. Almost always after the offering, you had a big fellowship meal. So let's look at covenant. I want you to have that background, but let's go ahead and start looking at some of these covenants. So the first one is in Genesis 31, and it's between Jacob and Laban. Now, I don't know if you remember this story, but Jacob went there, wanted to marry Rachel, worked for 7 years, and he snuck Leah in on him, and he married the wrong one. So he worked for 7 more years, and then he gave him Rachel. Now he had 2 wives. And then he went to his father-in-law and said, "I have made you prosperous with my work for you. Give me something so I can have something for me and my family." He said, "What do you want?" "I'll take all the speckled, streaked, and dark lambs that there are in the flock. I'll pull those out. That way you will know I didn't steal any of mine." Well, God blessed him because Laban had mistreated him. And so from that point forward, almost all of the sheep that were born were speckled or streaked or dark. So his flock grew and Laban's did not. So Laban's sons went to him and said, Jacob is stealing all our wealth. So they were getting angry about it. Jacob got worried about it, and Jacob told his wives, we better leave. So they got up in the middle of the night. They were 3 days' journeys away from Laban, so it took them a while to figure out, and they left. They took everything with them. Well, Laban found out about it, and he went after him, and he was angry. There's a side note to this. Rachel stole her father's guides and took them with her. Do you remember this? Put it in her saddlebag. And he was mad about that. He said, what are you doing? You stole my guides, and you're sneaking off in the middle of the night. And Rachel said, there's no way I stole your guides. And so he went searching for them, couldn't find them. And then he had to apologize. And Jacob said, all I did was make you prosperous, and now you're wanting to harm me. He said, I'm going to make a covenant with you. And so here's a covenant. He said, I won't cross these pillars we're going to put up and come after you, and you don't come back and harm me. And you don't marry anyone else than my 2 daughters. Those are your 2 wives. You don't marry anybody else. And we will have these sacrifices, and we'll eat this meal together. And so they had a covenant, and then they had a meal to seal the deal. And that's the way they did it in the Old Testament. So in Genesis 15, we have another covenant. And this one is between Abraham and God. So in Genesis chapter 15, God comes to Abraham and he says, I'm going to make your descendants greater than the stars that you can see in the heavens. And Abraham believed him, and it was credited to him as righteousness. And he said, well, God, how do I know you're going to do this? How do I know you're going to follow through with this? And God said, here's how you know. I'm going to make a covenant with you. And so the Lord said to him in verse 9, bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. So Abraham brought all these to him, cut them in 2, and arranged the halves opposite each other. The birds, however, he did not cut in half. So he took these animals and he laid them in a row, a half on each side. And then during the night, he had another dream from God. And then God came as a pot and as a torch and walked through those cut pieces of animal to form this covenant with Abraham. And he said, now I formed a covenant with you, and I promise you that I will not break my covenant. You have a guarantee because I made a promise to you, and I sealed it with this covenant. Now, back in those days, in that area of the world, it was not uncommon to cut animals in half and put them on each side. And the idea was that if you broke the covenant, you would be cut in half the way those animals were cut in half. And Jeremiah says, actually, that God, talking to Israel at some point in time, says, well, those who have violated my covenant and have not fulfilled the terms of the covenant they made before me, I will treat like the calf that they cut in 2 and then they walked between its pieces. So one of the things that happens when you come to the Lord's Supper, and most of the emphasis I'm putting on in the Lord's Supper during this series is one of community and joy. But there was also a part that had a reverence to it, or a solemn part to it, because you are remembering a covenant that you made with God. And it was a covenant that he promised to take care of us, and we promised not to break. And what happens sometimes, it happens real slowly. We sort of ease into covenant breaking things without really acknowledging what we're doing. And we wake up one day and our life has this huge hole in it. And this is a sinkhole. Now, the way this happens in life is people wake up one morning and their car's gone. It was swallowed up by a sinkhole. But what we know is the erosion of that soil didn't happen overnight. It happened over a very long period of time. And it's very subtle differences, and it gets to the point that a hole opens up in the ground. And here's what I want us to understand about our covenant that we make with God. In James 1, verses 13 through 15, he says, when tempted, do not say, God is tempting me, because God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. Every person is tempted when they are dragged off by their own desires and enticed. Then when desire conceives, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it's full grown, gives birth to death. So here's how this happens. It begins with desire. We want something that we know we shouldn't want. We think something that we know we shouldn't think. we do something that we know we shouldn't do. And they're little things at first, and we get dragged off by it. A lot of times it's just thinking and what we want, but we start focusing on that. And when you focus on it, eventually it gives birth to sin, because what you think about and what you want and little things you do eventually lead to actions that cause us to do things that we know we shouldn't do. And then it says that sin gives birth to death. So what happens when we break God's covenant and we walk away, even in simple ways, we wake up one day and we wonder why there's a gaping hole in our life. And it's because we walked away from the covenant with God and the God that promised to take care of us. And so these covenants are really serious. It's important that we take care of them. Here's another covenant I want to look at briefly, and it's the Sinai covenant. And it starts in Exodus chapter 19. So in Exodus 19, Moses goes up to Mount Sinai. This is 3 months after they left Egypt. They come up to Mount Sinai. Moses goes up on Mount Sinai. And in verse 3, God says to Moses, "This is what you are to say to the house of Jacob and what you are to tell the people of Israel. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all the nations you will be my treasured possession. And although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And these are the words you're to speak to the Israelites." So in these covenants, God initiates. God reaches out, offers to do something for us, and actually does something for us before we do anything for him. And that's what he did with Jesus. He loved us while we were yet sinners, died for us before we had done anything for him. And then Moses went back and summoned the elders and the people, set before them all the words the Lord had commanded him to speak. And the people all responded together, "We will do everything the Lord has said." So Moses brought the answer back to the Lord. So they consented to being followers of this God. And then what happens after that is God lays down the terms of the covenant. So every covenant has terms. Every agreement has things that we agree to do. And so these are in Exodus chapter 20 through 24. So we have the 10 commandments. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourselves an idol. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God in vain. Remember the Sabbath. Honor your father and mother. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not give false testimony. And you shall not covet your neighbor's wife. Interestingly, the two he spends the most time in here are, you shall not make for yourself an idol, and you should observe the Sabbath. He spends a lot of time on these. So those were really important to the Jews. Now, what we have to understand about idolatry back then is when they had these graven images, they believed those were gods. And they worshiped them as gods. And God says, you can't have a God that is a God before me or a God with me. Now, in our day and time, with modern science, very few of us think there's a God here or a God in any sort of graven image. But Paul says in Colossians that our idolatry has to do with the desires of our heart. We put something else in our life above God. So one of the things he's telling them is God comes first. And the Sabbath was an interesting one because there were all these conflicts between the Pharisees and Jesus over the Sabbath. It was a really big deal to them. But when you look here at the Sabbath, there's two reasons that you rest. One is we need rest. And it's a good thing he tells us to rest because we need rest. And then the other reason we rest is to remember that God did this work for us. He created for us. So Jesus says when you have to eat on the Sabbath, well, that's okay because the Sabbath was made for man not for the Sabbath. But when you go through here in Exodus chapter 21, 22, 23, and 24, you're going to find case law that is built on the 10 Commandments. So a few of these I'm going to share with you. One of them in chapter 21 is that if you're a Hebrew servant, you can only be a servant for 6 years. So here's what happened. Some Hebrews were so poor, they would go to a wealthier Hebrew and say, I'll be your servant or your slave if you just feed my family and take care of us because I can't do it. And so they would become a slave for eternity. But the Bible says after 6 years, they get their freedom. Now, there's a way for them to continue in service of their master if they need to. But the point is, he didn't want them enslaving their own people. So these rules are about justice and mercy. Another interesting rule has to do with some of the social justice and mercy in chapter 23. And he says in verse 9, do not deny justice to your poor. In verse 8, do not accept a bribe, for a bribe blinds those who see and twist the words of the righteous. And in verse 9, do not oppress an alien that is in your midst, because you yourselves know that you were aliens. So he says, when a stranger comes into Israel that doesn't belong there, don't treat him badly, because you used to be a stranger that didn't belong there. So he's talking about compassion and justice and mercy. And what happens is we learn from this covenant terms who God is. Now, you can tell a lot about who a person is by what they do. So we know a lot about God because of what he did with Israel. You know, I've learned a lot about this church by the things this church does. And so last night, I went to the senior dinner. And it was for all the older people. And I had a birthday yesterday, so I turned 60. So I guess I'm one of those older people now. And they surprised me with a number of things yesterday. For one, they had a cake, and the people lighting the candles on that cake obviously hadn't lit candles for old people very often, because they started around the edge and it got so hot they couldn't light the candles in the middle, which was good because I couldn't blow them all out anyhow. And so that was good, but they also decided that it might be fun to roast the preacher last night. So they did a really good job of roasting the preacher last night, and the winning roast was the Hee Haw production, which was by Lisa and Monty. And so I'd never watched Hee Haw, but they would say something like, well, no one can find our preacher. We called the police, and he went, and he was driving the wrong way on the highway. And then one of the other ones, well, we still can't find our preacher, and no one can figure out where he is. One of our deacons is waiting for him at Panera, and apparently he's at Chick-fil-A. And then they said, and we can't find our preacher again. And so we called Monica, and she said, well, I think he's rolling around on the bathroom floor. So obviously, if you're visiting here, those are all inside jokes. But then the best thing about it is they honored me with a special award yesterday. You know you're loved when you get a special award. So they gave me a big jar of pickles. I want you to know I'll be eating pickles for the rest of my life. And I can't wait to dig into these. I've never seen such a big jar of pickles. So what I knew, I better leave these out so I don't forget them. We'll put them right here on the Lord's table. So here's what I do know. Mark Mason caught me this morning and said, now, after last night, do you feel good or bad about that? Because they ribbed me, made fun of me all night. And I said, well, you know, I feel pretty good about it because I know that I was loved. And you know you're loved by the way people treat you and what they say to you. And this is a very loving family. If you're looking for a loving family, I've only been here 2 months and I already feel like I have a family. But God, when he lays down these rules for us, doesn't do it because he's some sort of dictator rule maker. God lays down rules for us because God cares enough about us to take care of us. So we find out through his covenant that God is a good God. God is a loving God. He's a God that wants to care for us. He's not a God that is out for himself. He's a God that's actually out fighting for us. These rules are to protect us and to keep us safe. And those are the types of covenants that God makes. And so now we have the table. We have the covenant, then we have the table. So when you get to chapter 24 of Exodus, he said to Moses, now come up to the Lord. In verse 3, Moses went and told all the people the words covenants that we just kind of flew through, and they all agreed to do them. And so he got up early the next morning, in verse 4, and built an altar at the foot of the mountain and set up 12 stone pillars representing the 12 tribes of Israel. Then he sent young Israelite men, and they offered burnt offerings. So there's the burnt offerings. No one ate those. And sacrificed young bulls as fellowship offerings. Those are intended to be eaten. And he sacrificed them to the Lord. And Moses took half of the blood and put it in the bowls, and the other half he sprinkled on the altar. And then he took the book of the covenant and read it to the people, and they responded, we will do everything the Lord has said, we will obey. And in verse 8, Moses then took the blood, sprinkled it on the people, and said, this is the blood of the covenant. Does that sound like something we heard a little bit earlier today when Ben was doing the Lord's Supper? So in Matthew 26, verses 27 through 28, Jesus took the cup, and after he had given thanks, he gave his disciples the cup, saying to them, "Drink of this, all of you." By the way, that's how you get one-cuppers. He takes one cup, hands it to them, and says, "I want all of you to drink from this cup, every one of you." And so there's a really good chance that it was one cup. Now, I'm not advocating one cup, especially when I see some of you coughing and sniffing, as I just heard a cough. And one of the points we'll make here is what makes the Lord's Supper isn't that you have the right elements in the right form and just one cup and that you do it around a table with a dinner, because if we're going to do it the way they did it, that's why we need to do it. I think it's something deeper that makes it the Lord's Supper. It's the reason we take it. It's who we're remembering when we take it. It's why we take it. That's what makes it the Lord's Supper. But when Jesus inaugurated the blood of that covenant, he says, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." And so we now participate in a covenant, and when we take the Lord's Supper, it's a covenant renewal meal. And so they've had the covenant, and now they're going to have the meal. And so it says in verse 9, Moses and Aaron and Nadab and Abihu and the 70 elders of Israel went up and saw the God of Israel. Under his feet was something like a pavement made of sapphire, clear as the sky itself, but God did not raise his hand against these leaders of the Israelites. They saw God, they ate and drank. Now, how do you see God? It says that even Moses could only see his back as he passed by, or he'd be smote dead. And so I'm not sure what they saw. It doesn't describe him. It just describes what he was stepping on in his feet. But they were in the presence of God. One of the interesting debates that's going to happen in the Christian church as they get older is they're going to start arguing that the bread and the blood are the real body and presence of Jesus. And the bread and the blood are just bread and grape juice or wine probably back then. But it's not, I don't believe it's the real body and blood of Jesus. But sometimes we forget when we argue about what these elements are that God's supposed to be there present with us when we take this communion. He's supposed to be here present with us when we gather together. And that should change the way we feel about and the way we think about the Lord's Supper when we take it. Now, there were 3 major festivals that they had. And all 3 of these festivals were the 3 most important ones for the Israelites, and they had to come back to Jerusalem to take them. And it was the unleavened bread, or the Passover. The harvest, or first fruits, was right when the harvest started. You took the first fruits and you gave them to God. And then the ingathering, or tabernacles, and they would live in booths, because often they would go and live in booths out in the harvest fields when they were all full to bring it in. They also remembered when they were living in tents during the time of the wanderings. And all 3 of those had fellowship offerings and great meals associated with them, every one of them. So what happened at these meals? I want to read these 3 passages quickly, and then we're going to summarize this. Deuteronomy first. And so in Deuteronomy 12 and verse 4, he tells them that they need to come to Jerusalem. And verse 6, there bring your burnt offerings and sacrifice, your tithes and special gifts, and what you have vowed to give, and your freewill offerings, and the firstborn of your herds and flocks. There in the presence of the Lord your God, and you and your family shall eat and shall rejoice in everything that you have put your hand to, because the Lord your God has blessed you. I'm not going to read all 3 of them, but here's what I'm going to tell you all 3 say. The next one, in Deuteronomy 14, says the same thing. When you eat in the presence of God. And all of them say joy. In Deuteronomy 14, he adds in reverence. So you should revere God, be respectful of God, but do it in joy, remembering what God has done. Now, when I did the Lord's Supper, mainly the way we do it is we're thinking about the sacrifice of Christ. We're examining ourselves in regard to sin, and that's a good thing to do in a covenant renewal, but we've lost the fellowship part of it. And we talked about that last week. It happened because of the way church architecture changed, and they quit eating in homes and they started going to buildings, and everybody were in these long, narrow buildings with their backs to them. They took the table from the center and put it at the front. And then instead of it being a fellowship meal, it became sort of this solemn, individualistic, silent moment. And that's carried over into our day and time. Although a lot of people are starting to occasionally do a Lord's Supper service that is a little bit different, just to remember there's other things that we should be doing or remembering when we partake of the Lord's Supper. Now, the thing that gets me the most when I read all this is how much joy they had in their covenant renewal. And so our invitation sign is called the Joy of the Lord. And when I was studying this and I kept reading, and actually he talks about the joy of the Lord in Nehemiah 8, and I remember that song. And I don't know about you, but the joy of the Lord has a lot to give to me. Yesterday, we've had a hard time getting our house set up and finished. And it's partly because we do too many other things besides just stay home and work on it. So Friday night, I went and celebrated my birthday. Saturday night, we came up here and we laughed at my birthday. And so, but Saturday during the day, I had these grand visions we were going to get a lot done. So I woke up that morning, but I had to finish my sermon and I had to do some bills. And finally it was 11:30 and I thought, man, we only have till about 4 and we got to get ready for church. But I had visions that we were going to get that living room cleaned up and the dining room cleaned up, and we were going to get our bed put together. And so I started working, and Monica said, I think you need to come over here and help me in the dining room. Well, I want to do all this work over here. And she said, no, I need help here. Let's do one room at a time. So let's unpack these chairs and put them together. So we unpacked them, and those chairs took forever to put together. And we only did 2 of them, and you couldn't find the hose, and it wouldn't screw in right. And we finally got 2 put together, and we went and set them down. And I said, what'd you pay for these? And she said, well, they weren't very expensive. And I said, well, I can tell. And I sat in one of them and I said, I don't think this is going to work. I'm afraid that if Jim Farley sits in one of these, they're going to break. And I really like Jim. And I don't think he'd be too happy with me. And not everybody's a small person like me and Monica. And so here we spent an hour putting together 2 chairs. Now we spent an hour taking them apart. And now I have 4 chairs that I got to get back to UPS. And so I got on Amazon. It was really easy to fix that up. And then we said, well, let's put this big antique mirror up. So we got that thing up and hoisted it up there. And I'm going to tell you, the table's about this tall, but this antique mirror is heavy. And Monica's only 5 foot tall. And I'm telling you, those last 2 inches to get that up to the marble just about killed her and scared me to death. We're going to lose that 1800 antique mirror. I wasn't too worried about Monica. She's pretty tough. But we got that thing up there, and then we took it back down to make sure it was in the right place. And we got it up there again, and we measured it, and then we took it back down. And then we decided I'd measured it the wrong way, and so we put it back up there again. And then we had 2 measurements. One was the right one, and one was the wrong one. So I got up there and drilled the wrong one. And we got it back up there, and I said, I drilled the wrong hole. So we took it back down again, so she got her workout in. We finally got it up there and all ready to go, and then I had to run to the UPS store, and I get there, and I only had 1 label, and apparently the other label didn't print out, and so I'm on my phone trying to figure it out for about 30 minutes. I finally get it printed out. I've done nothing yet but get a mirror up, and I had all these grand plans. Our bed came, we went down, and I took it all apart. At one point in time, I sat there, and I was so overwhelmed, I was doing nothing. I really was. And Monica said, Kevin, I'm the only one working here. You're just standing there doing nothing. And so I went upstairs because we had a new bed frame delivered, and I took off the old one and I put the new one together. But then there's a headboard and footboard that goes on. Well, we slept in the guest bedroom last night, just so you know. We never even got to that. So I go take this to UPS. She calls me. She needs glue. And it's pouring rain, and the umbrella isn't in the car. So I walked through there. You know what? I was thinking I need to call Mike, and we need to change the invitation sign. Because this joy of the Lord thing is not working for me right now. But I kept thinking this is going to pass, right? And life kind of beats you up sometimes out there, doesn't it? It does me. And I know we're going to get all this done and it's going to work out eventually, but yesterday it didn't feel like it for a little while. And then I thought, no, that's exactly the invitation that son I need is the joy of the Lord. Because these things are just earthly things. But the joy of the Lord is an eternal thing. And when we start trying to take care of our earthly needs with earthly things, we wake up one day and find a gaping hole in our life. They're not as fancy as we think they are. But when we're willing to trust and put our hope in the joy of the Lord, it's a meaningful thing that will change your life and fulfill your life and fill your life with God. And so if I get one thing about from the covenant to the table, when I come to church, I'm renewing my covenant with a God that promises to take care of me, a God that promises to meet my needs, a God that promises when you have a bad day, it's not that big a deal because better days are coming. And that's the God that we trust and the God we put our hope in. And so one of the things I want us to always remember when we come and partake of the Lord's Supper, it's a covenant renewal and God has promised to take care of us. And that should be a time of joy. It always was in the Old Testament. They came to those meetings with joy. They came to their Passover feast with great joy about what God had done, was doing, and was going to do in their life. And when we come to the Lord's Supper, we should come with great joy because of what God has done, what He is doing, and what we know He's going to do in our lives. That is a God that I can follow and put my trust in. So if we can encourage you to keep your trust in God and no one else, and to keep your joy in the Lord, we want to do that here. If we can pray for you, if you've had a bad day or a bad week or a bad year, or you've been tempted and or holes are starting to open up in your life, we want to be there for you because God promises that He'll rescue you and save you from all that. If we can pray for you, we'll have elders that are up front and at different places in this sanctuary. Please come forward. Let us pray for you while we stand and while we sing.
The joy of the Lord will be my strength.